FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency's whole purpose, their whole mission is to help people before, during, and after disaster. And there's been a lot of questions this week about FEMA funding. And these questions have been related to all sorts of things, from social media posts to comments made by former President Trump. This has been a pervasive question that's come up from critics of the current administration, but also just in general of, well, where's the money? How does disaster relief work? What do we need to know about that? And it's really important to remind ourselves is that if we're American citizens, this is actually our money being used. And FEMA is the federal distributor of those funds when it comes to disaster relief. The really important thing to pay attention to is when anybody in leadership actually declares something a disaster. So when the president's declaring something a disaster, even before a hurricane makes landfall, he's instantly freeing up federal funds and resources to flow to that area in anticipation. That's also true of a governor. That can also be true of a mayor. We saw this during the pandemic, that when different areas declare a disaster, the government start to have a different level of power. For example, they can put in traffic laws that they can't normally do on a regular basis without following a certain procedure if they just declare an emergency or a disaster. So that's just one example. But let me just talk to you a little bit about this disaster relief funding, because there's been all sorts of questions many of you have asked about, well, is it true that money from FEMA is going other places? What do we need to know about our money that FEMA is managing? And could it actually be going to places that we don't want when there's a disaster and someone actually needs it right in front of us? We can see it all over the news. So here's what I found, and this was really fascinating. The first thing you should know is that there's something called the Disaster Relief Fund, or D.R.F. It's the largest source of federal funding for any disaster, and this is what FEMA is managing. Over the years, it looks different depending on the money that Congress appropriates to it. And if we look at from the 1990s through 2022, a total of $347 billion has been put and used in these funds. On average, every year, about $12 billion has been spent. So that's where a lot of the disaster relief funding comes from. It's from this particular fund. It's only for disaster funding. And I've seen some different reporting on this, but some have described it as against the law for this money to be used in any sort of other way. It has to be used in this very specific way because that's what Congress approved it for. There's been a question that's come up online and also been talked about in political circles about whether or not FEMA money from the Disaster Relief Fund is going to places like the U.S. southern border. From what I can tell from my research, the Disaster Relief Fund is only for disasters like the ones that we are currently seeing on the news. However, there is FEMA money that does go directly to supporting those who have been encountered at the U.S. borders. And let me explain that. So there's something called the Emergency Food and Shelter Program that's been a part of FEMA since the 1980s. And it was approved, Congress is part of approving funds to this to help at different areas with hunger and homelessness. So in your city or your county, maybe there is a certain organization that's getting federal money. It could come from this fund to help with homelessness in your area. Over the years, though, Congress has given some different instructions for how this money can be used. And in fact, in 2019, Congress specifically supported some of the funds from this going to be used for those encountered at the border. Now, some people use the term migrants. At SmartHER News, we don't use the term migrants. I think migrants it's a generic term. I find it to be derogatory in many ways. You don't say, well, that's my friend, the migrant. These are people, they're men, women, children, they're coming across the border. There's different reasons, as we've talked about in the past. So we're going to talk about this group of people as those encountered at the borders. These are people that are encountered at the border that don't have a home and are likely don't have a lot of resources, could be hungry. And so these sort of funds in 2019 were allowed to be moved in that direction. 2019 was under the Trump administration. $30 million was approved for that during that time. But get this, over the last several years, the money approved for this particular use of that money ballooned up to $425 million as of last year. So it is true that there is a FEMA disaster relief fund that is only used for disaster relief. There's also a fund in FEMA that is used more specifically for troubleshooting these particular areas, perhaps in your own state, in your own county. And depending on where you are, it could be also used for those encountered at the US border.